Welcome back. We continue our study of Augustine, having completed his study of his life and something of his influence. We'll see more, really, about his influence as we continue on. This particular lecture is concerned with his thinking, his writing, and his thinking, and an way to understand him as writer and as thinker. And so let's go ahead and get right to this. As we noted, as we were ending last time, the Spanish theologian Isidore of Seville is alleged to have placed the following inscription above the cabinet in which he kept all of Augustine's works: "He who claims to have read all this is a liar." So it is a statement that reminds us how extensive Augustine's writings were. Along the same line, another friend and biographer, Posidius, wrote that so many things were dictated and published by him, and so many things were discussed in the church, written down and amended, whether against various heretics, expounded from the canonical books, for the education of the holy sons of the church, that scarcely any student would be able to read and know them all. That note there about the fact that he dictated his books, he didn't. Many of them were not written. Most of them were not written by him using his own pen on parchment, but he would dictate his books, and the story is told that he could actually dictate 2, 3, or even 4 books at the same time, using different scribes to take down what he was saying. So he had really incredible powers of concentration, apparently. So Augustine wrote a lot. That's an understatement. No ancient Christian writer has left us a larger corpus of writings than Augustine. This is quoting Gerald Bray. In cataloging his many writings, it's best to subdivide them according to the type of literature, which is what we will do here shortly. So the numerous writings of Augustine, the composition of which extended through 40 and 4 years, our mine of Christian knowledge and experience, the different ideas, sentiments, clear statements of truth, strong arguments against error, passages of fervent eloquence and undying beauty are balanced by, as this author says, innumerable repetitions, fanciful opinions, playful conjectures of his uncommonly fertile brain. His style is full of life and vigor, ingenuous plays on words, but deficient in simplicity, purity, elegance, and by no means free from the vices of what this author calls degenerate rhetoric and wearisome prolixity. So I guess this is an example of wearisome prolixity in this entire slide and paragraph that I'm just quoting. But this tells us that Augustine he used his abilities, as we saw from the survey of his life, as a rhetorician, as a teacher of rhetoric, to good effect in his own writings. He had a philosophical bent of mind from the very beginning. In his theological works, he everywhere manifests the metaphysical and speculative bent of his mind. He never abandoned or depreciated reason. However, he subordinated it to faith, and this is kind of a theme for this lecture, and made it subservient to the defense of revealed truth. Faith is the pioneer of reason and discovers the territory which reason explores. So his method was faith seeking understanding. This author writes, Augustine's understanding of faith and reason is carefully nuanced. At one point he writes, in certain matters therefore pertaining, this is Augustine himself, to the teaching of salvation, we cannot yet grasp by reason. So we can't come to salvation by reason, but which we are able at some point, faith precedes reason, so that the heart may be purified in order that it may receive and sustain the light of the great reason, which is, of course, a demand of reason. So what he's saying there is that reason can't supplant faith, can't be prior to faith, because then we wouldn't be saved. Reason can't bring us to that level, the knowledge of God and salvation, but it can be employed in order to, after faith has come, used in order to explore the faith and come to a better understanding of faith. In other words, with at least some things, the teaching of salvation, faith precedes reason, at least at first, because the teaching of salvation appears not to be something immediately recognizable to our reason. So we begin with faith. And over time, our hearts are purified. And as our hearts are purified, we are more and more able to reason, perhaps in a fuller and more robust sense than if we hadn't started with faith. It's this heightened and improved use of reason is actually a demand of reason. We must do this. So for Augustine, using reason, even the philosophies of the pagans, who were wise and rational men, he thought, men like Cicero, we saw he was enamored with Cicero at one point and never really lost his appreciation of Cicero. Plato, Plotinus, he's one of the Neoplatonic writers, was compatible, there's a typo here, was not incompatible with faith. So please recognize that even though I let that slip through the notes, this line should say was not incompatible with faith. So long as reason and philosophy was not allowed to contradict what the believer knew by faith, he could use philosophy. And we've seen this has been something that has been an issue going clear back to Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr approached philosophy in a fairly naive way. This seems to be a more careful and nuanced way. But Augustine was not unaware that our current and fallen state means that our present knowledge is only partial and incomplete, but also in various ways is caught up in the reality of fallenness. In other words, if we're going to use reason, we need to recognize that even after faith, our reason is something that's employed by us, we who are still sinners, still fallen, and our intellectual capacity is not what it should be because of our fallen condition. So here's what he writes. As fallen persons, we are liable to fail. And Augustine brings out our liability to fail to bear on the life of the mind. But on owing to the liability of human minds to fall into mistakes, this is now quoting Augustine, this very pursuit of knowledge may be a snare to him unless he has a divine master whom he may obey without misgiving and who may at the same time give him as much help to preserve his own freedom. So he recognizes his dependence on faith, his dependence on what God has given to us by faith, even if we use reason. We should never cease to philosophize, he says, even in later works in De Trinite and Civitate Dei. These are full of speculations. That's on the Trinity and the city of God there. Before his conversion, he followed a particular system of philosophy, first the Manichaean, then the Platonic. But after his conversion, he embraced the Christian philosophy, which is based on the divine revelation of the Scriptures. What then are the types of writings? So we'll run through this fairly quickly. We've already referred to this, the autobiographical writings, because everything we read about or talked about in the previous lecture on his life really comes from his confessions. He also wrote a book at the end of his life called Retractions, in which he kind of goes over his life again and retraces not only his theological errors, but some of the things that he got wrong in his thinking. Augustine composed the Confessions about the year 397, 10 years after his conversion, and this would have been the time again when he had taken up the position as bishop. The first 9 books contain, in the form of a continuous prayer and confession before God, a general sketch of his life, of his conversion, as we've seen, his return to Africa, and the salient points in these books are the engaging account of his conversion and the story of his last days of his mother. As we've said, the most important autobiographical work was his Confessions. The Confessions are one of the most popular writings of Augustine these days. They give us a deep insight into his character, but also into the process of religious conversion in general, and in some respects are have a sort of, again, themselves a philosophical or even psychological bent to them that many still find compelling and interesting reading today. The Confessions are structured as a meditation to God, a kind of extended prayers. We've said a number of times already. In one sense, they're a searing self-examination where Augustine takes a very hard and critical look at his own life. So that even in what would be outwardly trivial events, like the account of his stealing pears from a tree when he was very young, even when he wasn't hungry, for him become important episodes on a spiritual journey. They reveal the depth of the sinfulness that he felt and the overwhelming need he felt for the grace of God to forgive him and restore him. A large part of his writings were philosophical, and we don't really have time to even begin to sort of talk about those in too much depth. He was a professional philosopher. That was part of what it meant to be a rhetorician in that day. The dialogues which he composed at Cassicaeum, that's when I mentioned his philosophical revelries back in Milan and what he was trying to reproduce in Tagaste. That started back there. That was where he and his group of friends were just going to enjoy a sort of philosophical exchange and kick back and enjoy life on the intellectual level. The dialogues were composed there. That's one of those philosophical dialogues. And then the Contra Academicas Libre Tres, that is against the academicians. He combats the skepticism of a form of philosophy that was current in his day, one that he never adopted. It was the skeptical way. The doctrine that man can never reach the truth, that's the doctrine that he opposed. And he wrote a book called De Vita Beata, or The Happy Life, in which he talks about true blessedness. You can see by the date of that's, again, before he became the bishop of Hippo. Great many of his writings after he became the bishop of Hippo were exegetical. He concentrated to an unusual degree on the creation story. A lot of the ancient church fathers wrote on the creation story, and he commented on no fewer than 4 times. Beyond his many interpretations of Genesis, he wrote a work called the Heptateuch, or the 7 books from Genesis to Judges. And his works are not like commentaries so much as a sort of running dialogue with the book, asking different questions or solving different exegetical questions. More a handbook for those who are going to either write commentaries or preach on those books. By far the most impressive of these works on the Old Testament was his enormous exposition of the Psalms, and one of the only complete commentaries we have on them from the ancient times today. He was especially interested in hermeneutics, the science and art of interpretation. And on one of the most important books written on that subject is called On Christian Doctrine. So you think you're going to read a book on doctrine. It's actually a book on how to understand or get to doctrine from the Bible. Because by this point he believes that the Bible is the only real source of Christian teaching. So it had to be read in the right way. So he wanted to write a dissertation on this. Augustine made a fundamental distinction between things meant to be used and those to be enjoyed, uti and friu. He tried to demonstrate how the Bible leads us to the former, and because it is a means to an end to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. He wrote a number of doctrinal treatises. One of the more important works here, again, is the handbook that we mentioned before. That's the word there, enchiridion, means handbook, but it's really an exposition on faith, hope, and love, based on the Creed and the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments. It has become to be the basis of education for clergy. It was to become the basis of education for the clergy in the Middle Ages, and in that capacity played a major role in shaping the spiritual outlook of the Western Church for over 1,000 years. So it's doctrinal, but it's actually what we might call devotional or spiritual literature. The most important of his purely doctrinal writings is his 15-volume work on the Trinity, and we'll be taking a more in-depth look at that in a later lecture. He wrote a number of pastoral works as the head of a local church and leader of a monastery community within that church. He had a number of pastoral duties, and many of his writings, his letters, sermons, all were about these pastoral issues. However, he found time to write about specific subjects of the Christian life. And most important were connected with sexual questions on matrimony and widowhood and singleness. This is particularly relevant again because of his prior life, which we said in the previous lecture was really taken up with the sensual aspects of life, and then looking forward to what came to be the medieval notion of the need for monks to be celibate. His writings had a very important impact on the thinking of the Middle Ages in that respect. Some of his writings were polemical, that is, that they were argumentative. Some of his most important works were written against the heresies of the time. As we've already seen in our course, dealing with heresy takes up a lot of the course of historical theology, and Augustine engaged in quite a bit of that, answering the heretics, teaching the truth, teaching good doctrine in opposition to the heretics. The first of these heretical, polemical works was against the Manichees. He wrote a number of things against his Manichees, and of course, he had been a Manichee, as we've said, for a number of years, and so he found it important not only to deal with their heresies for the flock, but probably to overcome some of his own thinking, having been a Manichee for a while. The second group of which polemical writings which Augustine wrote were against the Donatists. And the Donatists had developed out of a controversy. Basically, what the issue there was is during the era of the persecutions that we saw in an earlier lecture, there were those who had denied the faith. Some of them had even turned over copies of the scriptures to those that were the persecutors, and so they had a problem when the persecution was over. How do you bring those people back into the church? This was the most serious of the heresies until Pelagianism, and we'll be looking at Pelagianism a little bit later as well. The second group of which the Donatists directed his polemic, as I've already said, after this is the same slide as we just looked at, but basically this is saying the same thing. So sorry about that. We're going to move on. The type of apologetic literature that Augustine wrote was extensive, but the most important of these is the 22-volume work of the City of God. And again, since we're going to be looking at that later, we'll go over that later, and I'll skip over that for now. He wrote so many letters and sermons. Obviously, as a pastor, a bishop for 40 years, he had a lot of sermons. And because he was the bishop of Hippo, there were many people that wanted his advice or his instruction for a number of issues, theological, pastoral, and other things. And so we have just a storehouse of good pastoral teaching from these letters and from these sermons. As the little box there says, like great many of the great theologians of the centuries, such as John Calvin and Jonathan Edwards and others, Augustine was a week-to-week pastor and spiritual leader. And so the great tradition of the pastor-teacher, or the pastor-theologian rather, really sort of has one of its great proponents in Augustine. Well, that's just an overview of, as we've said, a very large body of work by Augustine. And as I've indicated there, we're going to be looking at a couple of these works in a little more detail in future lectures. We'll see you then.